Good evening. My name is Lawrence Sherman, and this is the seminar on racial equity in Stop and Search, hosted by the Cambridge Center for Evidence-Based Policing. As the world awaits the jury verdict in the George Floyd murder trial in Minneapolis, we are pleased to note the triumph of a police officer who intervened in the chokehold that another police officer in Buffalo, New York, had on a handcuffed suspect in 2006. This intervention was ruled against Cariol Horn for having used inappropriate force against another police officer. She was dismissed just short of having earned her pension. She spent 15 years sleeping in her car and working as a truck driver, doing various other things with 5 children. And just last week, she finally won her battle in the courts to recover her pension, as well as the Buffalo City Council passing what's called Cariol's Law, which requires intervention by police officers when they see other police officers about to use illegal force. So with this example of some of the many ways in which we can promote the efforts of sworn police officers trying to seek racial equity around the world, I am very pleased to be joining colleagues from various British police agencies where there is great concern with these issues. And I'm just going to share my screen with you in a moment, and we can demonstrate the ways in which the participants today have been working on their contributions to policing. May I confirm with my team that we now have the slides on the screen? Yes. Well, racial equity in Stop and Search leads us to the proposal of a risk-adjusted disparity, or RAD, index. Our commentators will include James Vaughan, who is the Chief Constable of the Dorset Police, Deputy Assistant Commissioner Amanda Pearson of the Metropolitan Police Service, who is the National Police Chiefs Council lead on Stop and Search, as well as their program lead for inclusion and race. Our commentators include as well the National Police Chiefs Council lead on serious and violent crime, who is Assistant Chief Constable Dr. Jackie Sebire of the Bedfordshire Police. And I want to thank all of them for taking the time to talk with us at the Cambridge Center about these issues over some time period, about what evidence is important to look at in dealing with racial equity in Stop and Search. Arguably, there are 3 kinds of evidence that we should be thinking about. The first is the evidence about equal protection of law and the proportionality of police actions to the harm that is involved in disparities between races, both in crime victimization and in police responses, and how those two come together under the idea of equal protection of law. The second kind of evidence to consider is the effects that Stop and Search have on violence, not just everywhere, but in the hotspots of crime where most serious violence is concentrated, which is actually a very small proportion of the land space in every police territory. The third kind of evidence that we like to consider today, and which we will show you for the first time, is evidence on risk-adjusted disparity, and how, if we adjust for disparities in policing in relation to the disparities in victimization by violent crime across races, then we can examine the effect of using a RAD, or risk-adjusted disparity index, in seeking fairness, racial fairness in policing, both to protect people from murder and to protect people from unnecessary or over-policing. So on the first kind of evidence, to talk about the equal protection of law, there's 3 things we really need to look at. One is differences in victimization across races, most accurately perhaps described in relation to murder victimizations. Secondly, there is the well-known, much measured, much discussed difference in Stop and Search by races right across England and Wales. But thirdly, not much discussion about the extent to which any Stop and Search outside of high violence hotspots may be disproportionately intrusive in relation to the seriousness or the very low seriousness in most places of the violent crime that might be justifying the intrusiveness of stop and search. In terms of equal protection from murder, it is clear that there is great discomfort in even discussing this issue. This is a graphic that was put together by a doctoral student at Cambridge, Sumit Kumar, and published in the Cambridge Journal of Evidence-Based Policing last November. It's had over 8,000 reads since that time. And it's the only place I know of that you can find the trends in the rates of murder victimization per 100,000 by race in England and Wales for the last 20 years. The numbers are published by the Office of National Statistics, but they're buried. And they don't make it easy for police to think about the disparity in victimization. Dame Cressida Dick at the Metropolitan Police has often mentioned it, but it is not, as far as I can tell, something that is routinely inspected on or examined in relation to performance measures, although it is the underlying problem of inequality in crime victimization that I would argue leads to all of the issues around disparity in policing responses that are attempting to close these gaps. And of course, the bad news in looking at what was a very encouraging start to the 21st century with a huge drop in the murder victimization rate for Blacks in England and Wales by 2011-12, even further down to 2013. Since then, it has substantially reversed and almost doubled since 2014. All the while with the white rates at the bottom looking very flat. And incidentally, with the Asian rates being surprisingly higher, almost 2 to 1 in relation to white British. So there's a fundamental equal protection problem in the society and its structure of housing, opportunities, and other things that is driving inequality in murder victimization. That's a kind of tip of the iceberg, a symptom, not something caused by the police, but a problem that is put in the police lap when we hear people ask, why can't the police protect everybody equally? Well, to have equal protection in relation to the rates, logically, we have to have unequal responses to deal with these differential risks, to try to flatten everything out. And that leads to the kind of statistic which has been computed repeatedly for the Dorset police, and which for the last 5 years, ending in December 2020, we have independently calculated to lead to a difference based on the 2011 census count of Black residents in Dorset as a 20 to 1 difference. Now, there's lots of issues with using that particular denominator, and in a way, this entire webinar is about the denominator. But if we were to just take that as the starting point, we can see that the concerns with that kind of difference lead to a different direction than what other evidence might point out. So, for example, to say that we are over-policing Blacks in relation to population, it may be entirely true, but the question is, where is that under-policing or over-policing occurring? And around the world, we now have substantial research in criminology to show that most crime is concentrated in hotspots. Perhaps 5% cause 50% of the serious violent crime. David Weisbord and others have written about this. But what it means is that essentially 95% of the areas that are getting lots of policing are very low in violence. And a corollary is that there's probably too little policing in most hotspots of violent crime. So that if anything, to reduce the differential risk of murder across races, we need to examine where the murders are happening and to think about what we know about how policing can make a difference where the murders happen most often, and therefore whatever police might do in those areas would be seen as proportionate to the harm, whereas doing exactly the same thing in this vast terrain of Tokyo that you can look at, where there's almost never any violent crime, would suggest that intrusive tactics are entirely disproportionate away from the bulging volcanoes of those hotspots. All of that is true regardless of race. But Malcolm Gladwell writes about race in his last book, talking about how the use of stop and search, which he hails as a triumph of murder prevention in hotspots, how it's become uncoupled from the risk, and that the spread of stop and search to areas outside of hotspots has led to such tragedies as the death of Sandra Bland, who was put into jail for 2 nights for changing lanes without signaling, and committed suicide in that experience. But he quotes David Weisberg in the book saying, "Why are you doing vehicle checks in an area that hasn't had any violent crime in 10 years? It's disproportionate to be doing proactive vehicle checks just because the police can, without recognizing the intrusiveness of the vehicle checks." And indeed, very similar circumstances led to the death of Dwayne Wright in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, causing riots and the resignation of the police chief and other terrible consequences. All of this gets to the idea of whether we should have tiers of proportionate intrusiveness in policing relative to the serious violent crime risk. Rather than having a one-size-fits-all in terms of authorized practices, to think rather in terms of the cost of police intrusiveness relative to the gains that can be achieved, and how what might be very appropriate in crime hotspots wouldn't be appropriate outside of those hotspots. If 5% of the places produce 50% of the serious street crimes, why don't we focus on doing more doing more stop and search in those hotspots, and perhaps a lot less elsewhere without any kind of ban, since the power is there under any kind of intelligence, but to proactively talk about what we can do to make a community safer. I think the toolbox of policing for high violence hotspots is one in which we have evidence. And that brings us to the second kind of evidence that's important for all this. The effects of stop and search in hotspots is something that hasn't been tested yet in the UK. And I would say that's a very important gap to fill in this discussion. And I understand that James Vaughan will have something to say about that later in this webinar. We don't have tests in the UK, but we do have some research that looked at the effects of stop and search right across an entire city. And the flaw in that kind of analysis, which generally concludes stop and search doesn't have much effect on crime, when you look at its effect everywhere, we run into the mathematical problem that you can't stop crime where it's not occurring. And that's most places. Most of the area of London, for example, doesn't have any murders, doesn't have much serious violence. You really don't have sufficient implementation of a causally logical research design by just doing a correlation study. And yet that's the kind of study that's cited in the College of Policing guidance in relation to the effects of stop and search. The National Academy of Sciences, on the other hand, looking primarily at US research, in 2 of its reports, 2004 and 2018, has found when policing is concentrated on violence hotspots, it has very clear effects. What is the National Academy of Science? Well, it's an institute not unlike the Royal Society, but closely linked to the federal government as a source of independent brokerage for what we know through science. Abraham Lincoln started it. It's headquartered in Washington, D.C. And in 2018, it reported on the effects of proactive policing with conclusion 4-9 that evaluations of focused use of stop, question, and frisk combined with other self-initiated enforcement activities by officers that target places with violence or serious gun crimes and focusing on high-risk repeat offenders consistently report short-term crime reduction effects. Now, a lot of that's about gun crime. And so it's a big leap from this kind of study in Kansas City, which I did with their police department in the early 1990s, showing an increase in vehicle stops and pedestrian stops patrols, which increased gun seized, apparently discouraged people from carrying and using guns, 49% drop in crimes in which bullets were fired, compared to a very similar beat 2 miles away, where there was no change in policing proactive engagement, gun seizures or stops on the streets there, and no measurable change in gun crime. Now, many studies have been done since then, not randomized trials, but clear quasi-experimental trials that find the same thing. And if you look across the nation, when those trials started to be published in the early 90s, the practice across the US in terms of weapons arrest skyrocketed. Many more weapons were seized in weapons arrests, and at the same time, the homicide rate started to decline. It's not strong causal inference, but it's very encouraging in support of the idea that focusing more policing on hotspots, or at least on weapons and places where those weapons are likely to be found, it creates a what appeared to be a tipping point, or at least a turning point in the homicide rate across the U.S., which if I could show you how it also tracks on a huge drop in the rate at which Black Americans were being murdered in that country at that time. So does stop and search then help to promote racial equity? I think we can argue that if and only if the stops are targeted in places with high levels of weapons violence, or as Gladwell would say, that they're coupled to the problem they're trying to prevent, then they may, on average, create a causal mechanism in which people carry weapons less often, which will lead them to reductions in assaults and murders using weapons. And this arguably could apply to knives, but it could also create a more general deterrent effect of police presence where there's lots of people who might be encouraged not to engage in intergroup conflict, gangs, or even interpersonal disputes in those neighborhoods when the police presence and the activities by engagement, potential searches, et cetera, could lead to a leveling of homicide rates across the races. At what price in inequity in stop and search, you might ask? But the answer is not so easy, because if we add now this third kind of evidence, which is risk adjustment in relation to the risk of homicide across races, and adjusting the use of police activity like stop and search in relation to those risks, we can then create something that the Cambridge Center is training all of our apprentices in crime analysis and evidence-based policing to think of as the RAD index, the risk adjusted disparity index, which computes the rates of stops by the police, not by resident population, but by the number of violent acts committed against victims of that race in a lower super output area. It adjusts for the risk of crime on the streets, not the risk of crime in the population, when the population is very much behind closed doors at night, watching television or sound asleep. If we look at the race of the people on the streets who are getting victimized and use that as the basis for calculating the rates, we get very different results. We take this key idea of having crime events by race become the denominator in which to divide the police actions, such as stop and search, by race. And then we can take a three-step calculation. First, we divide the stops of whites by the number of serious violent crimes, SVCs. The number of serious violence crimes reported to have occurred with white victims in that lower super output area becomes the X value in this calculation. And then we do the same thing for for non-whites in the population. We take the stops of non-whites and divide them by the number of serious violent crimes committed against non-whites as the Y. And then when we divide that X, which is the rate of stops per violent crimes for whites divided by the number of stops per serious violent crimes for non-whites, we get this Z, or the RAD index score. Now, the first time you hear it, it's a little hard to absorb, so I'm going to give a few other examples. But let me just say why it's important to use this kind of calculation. The key point is that the current victimizations by race in a neighborhood are blind to whether the victims are residents or non-residents, but they are very much alive to the fact that those are the people who the police need to protect. because they are the ones experiencing victimization. And because those victimizations are a daily occurrence and they allow you to stay up to date for each time period, they can provide a guide for tasking police work in relation to stops as a preventative tactic, much more reliably than the census data can, even if it wasn't 10 years old. So even a brand new census outcome count for next year from 2021 will not solve the problem of resident population as a biased kind of measurement, and especially for a beach resort community like Dorset, which is very vulnerable to changes in the population by non-residents coming in. And that's all included in this stop and search rate per thousand by residential population divided by ethnicity. And this is the rate of 20 to 1 difference in which Black residents, counting all Black persons stopped as residents, which is the way it's computed, even though it's not true, and that the Dorset police estimates are that over 55% of the Black people stopped by the police are non-residents. But this calculation is based on pretty rigid adherence to the population-based formula of 20 to 1, and of the residential population, which then computes a 20 times greater likelihood for Black residents to be stopped than whites. So what does it look like with the RAD index? Well, it doesn't come out to be even, and not even close, but a lot closer than it was with the resident population. So it comes down to 6.6 to 1 in the Black-white ratio, the ratio of ratios that computes the RAD index. And it opens the door to the question of whether there could be emphases of policy in the areas with the greatest amounts of violence and the greatest amounts of stop and search, so that that ratio could be driven down even further, at the same time that the difference in victimization by serious violent crimes between Blacks and whites would be driven down. So all of this gives us hope for less disparity. But can we actually reduce that disparity with the level of measurement consistency that we currently have? Well, I think it is a problem that measurement is a key issue, because so much data are missing on the race of crime victims. So the stop and search reports, at least in Dorset, 98% of them have the race or ethnicity of the victim, but not the serious violent crime victimizations. And if those crime reports are leaving out disproportionately large numbers of Black victims who are victimized, they're being counted as victims, but not for that race, that could substantially alter the way in which the risk-adjusted disparity index is calculated. So if this idea is to have legs, I think the first step has to be to put as much effort into getting the race of crime, serious violent crime victims, as there is put into the race of who's getting stopped and searched. In the end, we have two separate questions. The first one is about proportionality to harm and how many stops and searches are needed in high violence areas to prevent how much serious violent crimes. That's something on which there's lots of research going on with Cambridge master's students working with departments like Bedfordshire, Essex, and the Home Office is taking important steps to focus on hotspot policing, whether there's enough patrol, which is a precursor of having more stops. And we'll have a lot more research news about that over the coming year. But that's all a different question from equality by race. When we look at the rate of stops per 100 serious violence victimizations that are so different, and we want to make them more equal. So the problem is to take something like the national rate of 77 stops per 100 serious crimes in England and Wales. That's the total number in the hundreds of thousands of stops divided into the total number of serious violent crimes. It's somewhere in the order of around 400,000 stops and 700,000 serious crimes, and we'll be publishing those exact numbers. But just as an example, if we had 7 stops of whites per 100 serious violent crimes against whites, and 70 stops of non-whites against 100 serious violent crimes against non-whites, then the non-whites would be 10 times more likely to be stopped than whites, according to the RAD index. The RAD index would be 10 to 1. That could be criticized as unjustifiably disproportionate, even though it adjusts for the risk of violent crime. So balanced policing would be looking for something closer to a 1 to 1. If, for example, we had 100 robberies in an area against white people, and there were 100 stops and searches of white people, since most violent crime is intraracial. And then for the black residents in an area, there would be 50 robberies of black residents and 50 stop and searches of black residents. Then you'd have this ideal situation, not ideal because there's a lot of crime, but ideal in terms of police responses, which are perfectly fitted to the risk for each race, of 1 to 1 in the whites, 1 to 1 in the non-whites, and therefore the ratio of ratios suggests balanced policing, that the risk-adjusted disparity index is 1.0. Now, I don't think it's going to be easy to achieve that at the same time that you're trying to reduce violent crime. I think what can be done, and here's another example which you can find on our website. I think what you can do is research that will target where stops are occurring, where the risk-adjusted disparity index is highest, where the violent crime is the highest, and perhaps where the race of victims is most often underreported for serious violent crimes. Can we then increase stops in these areas with good racial identification of the people stopped, as well as the people victimized in the crime reports? Can we even think of ways to equalize the stopping that would be good for the overall crime reduction in the area, which might include more stops of white people and more reduction of crimes against white people as well as against black people? All of this is complex, but I think it's feasible. And I think the caveat to do this on a place-based focus, rather than trying to do it across a large area based on population, is really important, because it starts by limiting the risk-adjusted disparity to high crime places, and that's half the battle in reducing racial disparity, to make it proportionate to harm rather than being seen to be proportionate to race. All of that is why Dorset has opened the door to having this discussion with Cambridge and with other colleagues around the country. I'm now going to exit from this slideshow and invite the Chief Constable of Dorset to comment on what I've said and perhaps what his plans are for next steps. So please welcome James Vaughan. James?
Good evening, Professor Sherman, and it's a great pleasure to join you tonight, and good evening everybody else that's listening in to the webinar. I'm the Chief Constable of Dorset Police, and some people may ask why Dorset Police are so interested in being involved in stop and search research. Dorset is a beautiful rural West Country county with a resident population of 772,000 people. We have one of the lowest crime rates in the country, and we enjoy one of the highest levels of trust and confidence from the public, including all communities here in Dorset. But we have an Achilles heel, which is, when measured against resident population, our disproportionality on stop search is the highest in the country. It makes us an outlier by, and pardon the pun, a country mile. It's an uncomfortable truth for a Chief Constable. I've been a Dorset police officer for 9 years. I've been in policing for 30 years. And the fact that we are a national outlier as a police force is something that I take very seriously and take personal responsibility to understand and respond to better. There's two things that, Professor, that causes me to lose sleep. The first is the levels of violence in England and Wales, and in Dorset. Last year we had 950 knife crimes. I know that there's very many more, thousands of that in some of our large cities, but 950 knife crimes in Dorset is a lot for a peaceful county. Most of that is concentrated in just a small handful of lower super output areas. So I'm really interested in looking at the problem differently. One of the things that an early mentor of mine told me was, you cannot solve a problem unless you truly understand it. And one of the reasons why I'm so excited to work with you, Professor, and the university and the Centre for Evidence-Based Policing, is I truly want to get to the heart of understanding why disproportionality in Dorset is so high. And I've not ruled anything in, and I've not ruled anything out, and I'll be bound by the evidence that we find. We are very, very keen to take research and thinking to a new level, and be used as an area to do research that's not been done anywhere else in the world to date. And I can give you a flavour of that, and test, perhaps in the time, test a different way of measuring disproportionality. Let me just give you a couple of factoids that might help set the context for Dorset. As I said, Dorset has a resident population of 772,000 people. On a typical bank holiday in the summer, we can expect that population to be at least double. Last July, on the 8th of July last year, 500,000 people, the entire population of Bristol, was on Bournemouth Beach alone. So we have this, so the way we currently measure disproportionality is really, really unhelpful. We have a huge visitor population, 20 million visitor days a year. That's the first problem. The second problem is we have a vibrant economy here in Dorset, and many people are coming to Dorset to make lives, and they are migrating out of some of the large cities, particularly London, where the pressures on housing costs are so great that Bournemouth, which is only really a stone's throw away, is a great place to come and make a new life, and do so in an affordable way. So we have a burgeoning population. And for instance, between the 2001 and 2011 census, we saw the Black and Asian communities rise from a few thousand to tens of thousands, hundreds of percent increase. So we know and expect, and we know through other data, schools data and some commercial data, that the community, the population, the demographic in Dorset has continued to grow since 2011, and we'll know this year what the level of the declared residential population has arrived at. So you have a census data that was badly out of date already in 2011. You have given us a very low base of a resident population according to that census, only 2% of people being Black and about 4% overall Black, Asian and minority ethnic, against a huge visitor population and a growing population. And then you add to that another factor, which is, like many rural areas in the country, we suffer from the exportation of criminality and violence from the cities in the form of what is the latest brand, which is county lines criminality. So lots of young people come to Dorset to trade in the illicit drugs market, bringing violence and drugs and misery with them. And they are targeted. People are targeted according to intelligence to try and bring a firm grip against that violence. And it's that violence that causes me the most trouble. It causes me to have the most troubled sleep. Young people, I think most weekends here in Dorset, we have a near miss with a young person being murdered. Most weekends here, even in a peaceful place like Dorset, we have a stabbing of a young person. And often, and as Professor Sherman pointed out, the victimisation rates here in Dorset are about 5 times higher, the disproportionate to the tune of about 5 to 1 for serious violence and homicide. So that is a big problem that needs solving. And at the same time, I want to understand better and respond in and provide a better response to disproportionality. So bringing an RCT, a controlled trial here to the county, it's a great place to do it because we have a city-sized town on our coast and a conurbation of 400,000 people with that big visitor population, with some high crime areas. 3 of those are on the national crime hotspots for violence. And then we have a large, peaceful rural area. I'm willing here in Dorset, ethically, and I think it's ethically sound, for us to potentially look at policy and tasking to withdraw almost completely stop and search out of low crime areas, focus stop and search and other hotspot tactics in the lower super output areas where we have high harm, particularly where there is disproportionality against young black men. So, Professor, we're really excited to be involved. We are happy to be a guinea pig. I think I have a moral and ethical responsibility to lead this piece of research for policing, despite the fact we're not a large city, but we have this outlying position and an interesting locality and some interesting data, which I'm very grateful for Sumit to bringing together for us. So I'll stop there. You wanted to speak for a few minutes, so I'll stop. I'm very happy to take questions.
Thank you very much, Chief Constable. I'm going to now call on Deputy Assistant Commissioner Amanda Pearson in the Met, who again leads on stop and search as well as program on inclusion for the National Police Chiefs Council. She's formerly worked with the Thames Valley Police and drove crime down in the city of Oxford. And I'm very hopeful that we can have this broader dialogue, not only today, but even in July when we have hopes of discussing this with the police minister at our annual conference on evidence-based policing, as well as with some of our commentators tonight. So, Amanda, what do you think?
Thank you, Professor, and thank you, Mr. Vaughan. The first thing to say is that I'd really welcome more research and testing on the area of stop and search. You know, it's one of those powers that we hold really dearly on behalf of the public. And from my perspective, our overall objective should be that officers have confidence in the use of that power. And at the same time, our communities have confidence in the way that we use it. And I do think we can achieve that balance. We found it tricky to do so over the past few years, but I do think we can find that balance. And actually, when you listen to our communities, what our communities are saying, and in particular in London, what our Black communities are saying is, we want to see equality around the equality of protect and pursue in policing. And this area of research and the testing that Dorset are willing to do is really looking at how to strike that balance between protecting people around the risks of victimisation and also using those powers that we have around intrusion. So I think we need to ensure that we can use this opportunity to look at the data, but then also test the ideas around the data that we've got so far to see and to give officers themselves confidence that when we're tasking and briefing them, we are asking them to use this power on behalf of the public in the right places at the right time where it's likely to have the most impact in terms of tackling violence. And if we're transparent about that and we're upfront and we're honest with the communities about where we're using it in that way and why we're using it, I think that will go a lot of the way to restoring confidence in our communities about the use of stop and search. I think what's interesting about this research is it really goes beyond what we've been doing so far, which is trying to take unexplained disproportionality and moving that to explained disproportionality. So that's often what police forces have been doing. We've been publishing stop and search figures. We've then been providing narrative to explain why we think there might be disproportionality in certain areas. But actually the way that's received by the public is that often that's us being defensive and that we're using the figures to do that. I think what this does is take that one step further to say, how do we use that kind of analysis to then influence the policy and practice we have for policing an area, and actually really taking some quite bold steps to make a difference in the change in the way that we police that area. And I think what would be really important listening to that and listening to Mr. Vaughan speak is how we communicate that to our communities and to the public, how we explain what we're doing, we're transparent about that and we're open about it. And that we also, as part of this testing, and I'm sure that will be the case, we understand, we track and we evaluate the impact that it has on the communities in those areas and the confidence of those communities and their perceptions of fairness in policing. So I guess one of the only things I wanted to say, and it's probably not so much from my Metropolitan Police role or even my national role, but just personally thinking, we're really moving into an era of very bespoke policing, depending on different places and very small areas in terms of geography. And I wonder whether our public are ready to kind of sacrifice what continually we hear the ask for, which is around consistency, for this bespoke approach to policing. And I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Amanda. That's a great question, and I think it's in medicine, it's in education, it's in so many areas, because digitization of data makes it possible for us to even ask the question. But ultimately, the medical research is suggesting that the more we can make the exact practice for each patient under a wide variety of conditions the best thing they can get, the better it is for the patients. And medicine and policing are not the same, but somebody who has taken the public health approach in her own research on domestic abuse is our next commentator, Dr. Jackie Sebire, who is the national lead, not just on stop and search, but on everything possible that could be done to try to reduce serious violence in this country. And at the same time, to shrink that gap between the seriously increased risk of death through murder or other kinds of violence against Blacks compared to whites. So, Jackie, you've been following this discussion for some time now. What are your thoughts based on what you've heard again tonight?
Thank you, Professor Sherman, for that introduction, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for the opportunity to sort of contribute to the conversation this evening. And there were just a few points I wanted to sort of reflect on, really, in terms of my role as the National Police Chiefs Council lead for serious violence. And since 2018, the strategy, and the right strategy, in my opinion, has been that we have been following enforcement hand in hand with engagement and violence reduction through a multi-agency partnership, primarily in violence reduction units. But when we look at that enforcement piece, that has been about deploying officers to hotspots. We know hotspots works. We have so much evidence about hotspots. Now, we can talk about data and data reliability, and that's certainly a whole other webinar, isn't it? But we know hotspot policing works. And we've seen that since we've been deploying this surge into hotspots, this surge of enforcement into those areas, those high crime areas, stop search has increased by about 55% in those areas. So we've got people in there, we've got our colleagues in there working really hard in these hotspot areas. And I've lost track, and I'm sure colleagues on the line have lost track on how many times we hear, well, stop search is a useful tool. Well, it is a useful tool in the fight against serious violence if it takes weapons off the streets, if it's disrupting our drugs markets, which are such a primary cause of the violence we're seeing. Mr. Vaughan's already spoken about county lines. So yes, it is a useful tool. But the question we need to be asking ourselves is it the right tool? Because if it causes more harm than good, should we be doing it? And if stop search is threatening police legitimacy with the very populations that we need to be engaging with, young Black males who are at the most risk of violence, then is it the right tool? Are we measuring the right things? These are things that police leaders, community leaders, we need to be having these uncomfortable discussions about. Because we know, and it is my strong, strong belief, that serious violence is the result of deprivation and poverty within these areas. The more cohesive our communities are and those societies within those areas, the more legitimate policing is within those areas, the better chance those areas have of improving poverty and deprivation and improving the life chances of those people living in those communities. So if we are doing stop and search in a targeted, legitimate way and measuring it through things like the RAD that seem to make complete sense in terms of how we're measuring stop search and targeting targeting it in the better way, then surely we'll have more cohesive and legitimate policing in those areas and more cohesive social opportunities for people living and working there. So I applaud Dorset for what they're doing. I'm really excited to be part of this this journey and part of these discussions around how do we police hotspots better and how do we become more legitimate in our communities. And I think looking at a lens of the RAD, looking at how we can measure things differently and have different conversations is really, really important to the bespoke policing piece that Amanda raised. So thank you again, Professor Sherman. I'd be really interested to hear what reflections people on the line have regarding this topic tonight.
Well, thanks very much, Jackie. And I'm going to ask Suzanne Kanabi-Nicole to put all four of us on the screen because I want to take the last point Jackie made, reflecting Amanda's notion of bespoke policing, and come back to James Vaughan to hear a bit of what you might have in mind in terms of local consultation, given the fact that from what I know about the top three nationally included group of hotspots, as I would calculate them, one of them is a nighttime economy area without as much residential population as you would normally expect to be associated with that much crime, whereas the other two are residential. So now we're getting bespoke about bespoke, but I suppose the basic issue that we talk about at Cambridge is dialogue. How do you have a dialogue with a residential community about this, quite apart from the issues about having it with the nighttime economy area? Maybe we just focus on the residential because that might be more common. We often hear that it stigmatizes a residential area to do hotspots policing in the first place. But when that statement is made, it's not traded off against any kind of estimate of how many violent crimes are prevented. And indeed, what's the measure of stigma and what harm do we know actually comes out of having more policing in an area, especially if, as many have discussed, there is consultation with community leaders and the communities engaged. And I know you and your colleagues have talked about that in Dorset. So maybe you can share your thoughts on consultation and maybe hear from the others as well.
Both, thanks, Professor. Both Jackie and Amanda both mentioned the importance of this sort of community buy-in around this and building community confidence. We have high confidence in Dorset from all communities in our policing approach, but we need to maintain that and make sure that any experiment that we do, any study that we do to gain a deeper understanding doesn't damage that community confidence. We currently have communities that come in and they scrutinise stop search. Currently, we scrutinise every every stop search that's done against a black person is scrutinised and the body worn camera is looked at by the scrutiny panel, and they give high confidence in the legitimacy of the use, albeit it's very disproportionate. So, but we want to go one step further. We want to bring the community to the research design stage. And ask the community and test with the community whether there are flaws in our research design. And you heard at an event last week how I was challenged by one or two students at Cambridge on this stigmatisation of a lower super output area, or the stigmatisation, and particularly if that lower super output area has a high demographic, including black men. So there is some very difficult questions to ask, and we're going to bring those communities closer to the research to seek their support, help, and monitoring potentially of how we go about the research. They're really important. We can't just go and do it and then deliver back to them our findings. But we won't win their confidence that way.
Well, that's really important to get on the table, and maybe I can ask Amanda and Jackie to comment on any contact you've had with parents of murdered children. And I certainly read in the papers in London about murders of teenagers where the parents say that they want more stop and search because they think that will help to prevent the kind of loss that they have suffered. And then they say, but it's got to be done in a nice way. And so actually this meeting we had last week, we're talking about how we could try to improve not just the tracking, but also the delivery of polite, respectful, explanatory, procedurally just encounters. But do you think that there is a constituency of survivors of murders of young people who might be willing to speak up on behalf of their view that it's not stigmatizing to try to help to reduce this kind of risk? Or how do you see that from your London experience? And then let me ask Jackie the same question nationally. So Amanda?
Yeah, thank you. So, certainly, as you say, in London, we do have communities who are asking us to come in and do more stop and search and to remove weapons from the streets and reduce the risk of their children becoming victims of serious violence. But as Jackie said, it's not the only tool for tackling violence. So I think what's important when we're engaging with those communities is to talk about the broader activities that policing and our partners are doing in those areas to tackle the violence, not just stop and search itself.
Okay, that's great. Jackie, what else do you want to tell us about that issue?
Yeah, just to answer your question really about mothers, because I think mothers of murder victims have a really, really important role to play here. And just personally in Bedfordshire, we've employed the mother of a young man that was carrying a knife for protection and was stabbed to death. And she now works with us, going into schools, talking to young people, because I can do that, but my voice doesn't carry any weight. Hers does. She shows pictures of her son and what happens and talks about why he carried a knife. So I think, Larry, you've rightly pointed out the really important role of mothers in this area and how impacted that school's education piece can be.
That's great. Thank you all for those comments. I'm going to give us some comments from the audience. If Suzanne can display the comments on my screen, and I'll see whether some of them are questions that I can direct to various members of our group in this discussion. So Suzanne, I'm not seeing the comments at the moment. Here's one from Marie Spencer. The question is, how do you deal with transient crime where the suspects travel to areas to commit crime and then return home? If you can't stop and search them en route, then you are missing the opportunity. I think this question sounds ideal for somebody from Dorset, which certainly has a lot of that situation. James, do you want to try to answer that?
So yeah, we do, as you mentioned earlier, 56% of black men that we search in Dorset are not from Dorset. They are, the majority of them are from London or Liverpool, and occasionally from Bristol. And the intelligence tells us they are engaged in county lines. And for people engaged in the webinar tonight, county lines is the new brand of very dangerous drug dealing, spilling out of the cities with very, very serious criminals at the head of a telephone line, exploiting young people to come out of the cities to trade in drugs, illicit drugs, in rural areas and smaller towns. We suffer with a whole host of county line criminality and young people who are themselves being exploited often through drug debt and are bound into the trade because of their own risk and safety, who then try to employ and exploit other young people locally. So there's a whole range of tactics. Of course, stop and search is one of the tools that we are using, hence our disproportionality. But there's also other, that is, as I think Jackie has been saying all evening, it's not the only tool that tackles violence. We are looking at transport infrastructure. We're looking at better intelligence around the network, how people are getting to places like Dorset. We are tackling the venues where drug dealing is happening, where it's often called cuckooing, where people come down and take over a vulnerable person's premises and there's a pop-up drug dealing den. We are trying to target harden too, because I think the point that in the message there was around what we're doing around prevention, and what we're doing around prevention. The county lines approach in Dorset is a neighbourhood approach, which is about putting a safety net around vulnerable premises and tackling hardened criminals and vulnerable kids that come down and sell drugs and violence too. But we are making it a harder place to establish county lines network. So it's a really good one. But should British Transport Police be doing stop and search at Waterloo Station rather than us doing stop and search in Boscombe? That's a really interesting question there. But yeah, I get the point that's being made.
Okay, well, thank you. Suzanne, do we have another question that you can display? This is from Nick Glynn, who is formerly, is the same Nick Glynn I know, formerly with Northamptonshire Police and College of Policing. And his question is, can Dorset incorporate the traffic stops pilot that's ongoing in the Met to include them in the research? Many of the stops emanate from traffic stops and would otherwise be missed. Amanda, maybe you can tell us about this pilot that's in the Met that Nick's asking about.
Yeah, I can do. At the moment, we're piloting in the Met, and I know another couple of forces are doing this. The same this is actual stops under 163 of the Road Traffic Act. So it isn't in relation to stop and search under Section 1. Is what we are doing at the moment is tracking and recording those searches and recording the ethnicity of people who are stopped under that vehicle power to see if there is any pattern in terms of disproportionality, because that's clearly the perception amongst some of our communities.
And could you tell us, for the uninitiated, what is exactly that section and what is that power?
So that's the power that gives police officers the power to stop a vehicle that's on a road, and also to require the driver of that vehicle to produce their driving licenses and things like that. So it's a very different power to stop and search because it doesn't require reasonable grounds for suspicion. This is more about, this is part of your ability to be able to drive a vehicle on the road, is that you can expect to be stopped by a police officer to check that you are legal and safe in terms of driving.
But in effect, it enables random stops without specific factors to justify the stop. Is that correct?
Yes, it doesn't require grounds for stopping the vehicle. The vehicle just has to be on the road.
Well, it's fascinating because the Australian police, of course, can stop cars at random for breath test to measure the alcohol content of the driver's blood, which is not a power that is commonly available in the US, and I don't think it's available here, not to compel the breath test. But even to compel somebody to be stopped to produce their ID, I've been living here for 14 years. I didn't know that was legal in this country. So maybe there's a communications issue in terms of at least making the general public aware that these powers are out there, they can be used, and that perhaps there's a question about whether their optimal use might be in high violence areas, given that the power is there, but it's intrusive. Maybe there could be a discussion about even across London, most of which doesn't have serious violence, but which certainly has a limited resource capacity. Do you think there'd be any discussion about concentrating those stops where there's the most knife crime, according to John Massey's analysis of the lower super output areas that have had multiple knife crimes?
Larry, as roads policing is actually part of the next round of sort of funding for serious violence, and we're looking at tracking those county line transit routes with roads police officers. So again, targeting where the intelligence is telling us those key routes are. So it is certainly part of that conversation that's ongoing at the moment.
Well, I'm sorry. Go ahead, James.
Professor, there's probably a key distinction to be made here around the legitimate work of roads police and officers in reducing road casualties, and we do have a blanket power to stop any vehicle on any public road as long as you're an officer in uniform. That doesn't give that officer automatic grounds to search the vehicle or the people in it. And that's a big distinction. And I think the two sometimes get confused. And there's a danger that if you use road traffic powers to try and combat violence, it could be an abuse of that power because it's actually there for road safety. So it's one of the considerations, ethical considerations that we have to go through.
And of course, it's a huge issue in the U.S. after the killing of Dwayne Wright, who was stopped because he had something hanging from his rearview mirror, or at least some of the accounts said that. And the issue, I think, for people who are critical of roads policing is whether that responsibility should be taken away from police altogether. A number of law professors have been writing a lot about that. And 100 years ago, one of the major police reformers in the U.S., August Vollmer, said he didn't want police to do traffic enforcement because people like police, but they won't like them anymore after they have to deal with them in traffic enforcement. And I think it was one of the more prescient forecasts about the future of police relationships with citizens. Our relationships with everybody on this webinar, I think, will be better if we keep our promises and draw it to an end. But we have heard a bit about analysis and intelligence, and I just want to say that the Cambridge Center is now making widely available at no cost to English police forces the apprenticeship program for level 4 apprenticeship analysts, analyst apprenticeships, intelligence analysis with an evidence-based policing format. So we're going to hear from some of our recent students taking these courses online with us that don't require coming to Cambridge, although the apprenticeship will have a 2-day start and a 2-day finish in Cambridge. And we're also hoping that these issues, the tools like the RAD index, the tools like the crime harm index, can help to support more reduction of serious violence crimes for everybody, and perhaps more racial equity in all of these outcomes. I want to thank Jackie Sebire, Amanda Pearson, and James Vaughan for your time. And I want to thank everybody who is with us tonight for joining. I'm now going to ask Suzanne to let us hear from people who've been taking these analytic courses at the Cambridge Center for Evidence-Based Policing. Thank you all and good night.
Thank you.
Ben Luce, I'm a Detective Chief Inspector and I am the Kent Police Biointroduction Unit Manager.
Paul Dwyer, and I'm a Chief Inspector and the Drugs Lead in the Metropolitan Police. So I'm the Strategic Lead for tackling drugs-related violence in London.
I'm Mark Powell. I am one of 2 directors for the Violence Reduction Unit across Kent and Medway.
It's around understanding harm rather than simply counting crimes, and I think that's a really significant challenge at the moment. We deal with volumes of crime rather than harm, so I think there's a big culture change.
Understand impact of some of the things that we are doing. So I think it gave me a really helpful kind of conceptual framework for how you might think about things in advance of identifying your response to that particular problem or challenge.
I wanted to learn more about evidence-based crime analysis for proactive strategies. I've gained an enormous amount of knowledge in what works, and by studying the research that already exists, I can support my strategies with evidence going forward.
Well,